Okay, cool. Well, thank you everybody for joining. We're just sort of getting our speakers filtering in. Tech issues seem to follow Serena and I wherever we go. But thank you everybody for coming tonight, and thank you to all of our speakers for coming. We're coming from all different time zones. Thank you to Leimomi for coming. I think it's midnight there in New Zealand. So we are very, very grateful. So we're delighted to host or sort of open our first online event for the Making Historical Dress Network. So this event is titled Commercializing Remaking, the Business of Making Historical Dress. So obviously, remaking historical dress not only opens creative and scholarly opportunities, but it also opens commercial opportunities. And one of the aims of our network was and is to create connections across academic and commercial worlds. And so this sort of seemed like a great way or an ideal topic, I guess, to kickstart our first online event. So in this online panel, we bring together people who have made recreative practice their business. And each of our speakers will share their approach to commercializing remaking before participating in a discussion at the end. And also before we get started, I just wanted to announce that our registration for the festival in September, so our final sort of large event of the network, is now online. We'll share that link in the chat for everybody. So there will be limited in-person places for the festival, and it's a bit of a first come, first serve sign up basis. So we encourage people to go and check out that link once we post it. Otherwise, certain sessions will be live streamed, and then we will be recording hopefully all the other sessions. So just some quick housekeeping as well. As I said, we're going to introduce each one of our speakers and then they will speak. But if you have any questions, Serena is sort of moderating the chat. So if you'd like to place them in the chat for our speakers, we can ask them for you at the end. So our first speaker tonight is Ninya Mikhaila. So Ninya and Jane are going to speak separately, I believe, and then speak together at the end. So I'll introduce Ninya first. So Ninya is a historical costumer who has specialized in quality reconstructions for museums and heritage sites since she set up her business in 1994. So she is one half of the Tudor Tailor, who I'm sure everybody here knows, a company which provides research and resources for learning about making 16th century dress. So Jane Malcolm-Davies, who'll speak after Ninya, is an associate professor of textile studies at Uppsala University. So she has particular interest in reconstructed clothing, in the visitor experience at heritage sites, on which she's provided consultancy services through JMD & Co. since 1992. So she's also one half of the Tudor Tailor, which, as I said, was a company that provides research and resources for learning about and making 16th century dress. So Ninya, I'll let you take it away, and then Jane can come in afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody, whatever time of day it is, where you're watching from. Yeah, so I'll start just talking a little bit about me and what I do and how I started before Jane and I speak together about the Tudor Tailor itself. I do get asked this question quite a lot, and I don't know where all of you are coming from in terms of your background and interests, but this might sound familiar. Just being asked, how did you get into such a niche and obscure and weird line of business? And the answer is really initially from a love of history. As a child, I really didn't enjoy school. But I did really enjoy history. I think that my teacher at primary school, who taught the whole range of subjects, really came alive when it came to history and managed to transmit that, that excitement and enthusiasm and passion for history. So that was the beginning. And then another element is that my mum always sewed. We had lots of homemade clothes as children, me and my sister, which I loved, although I have to say, the homemade clothes were a little bit part of why I didn't always fit in at school. But there was that sort of inherent understanding of clothing and textiles from just being around it at home. And then really it was through being introduced to living history and historical reenactment as a young teenager. My mum took myself and my sister to Kentwell Hall in Suffolk, where we lived as Tudor people. And a very important element of that for me was researching, making and wearing Tudor dress. And it really established for me at the beginning that my interest in the history of dress would be nothing without the interest in the history of people. It's the fact that it's so closely linked to social history, and it is about people. However, having discovered all these things that I loved, I didn't actually quite put two and two together when it came to deciding what I was going to do for my career. I really was unsure about what I wanted to do as a grown-up adult person. And it was actually my stepmother at the time who said, well, why don't you do something to do with costume? And it was a bit of a light bulb moment. It was so obvious I hadn't even thought of it. So I went to the London College of Fashion and studied, well, it was a theatrical costume course, but by then I already knew that I wanted to make clothing for museums and heritage sites, and I wanted to make them as historically accurate as I could. So when I left the London College of Fashion, I knew that I would not be able to just go and get a job of employment because there was no company doing that kind of costume making that I was aware of. So I set up my own business with the help of the Prince's Trust back in 1994. So it really is the only thing that I've ever done. And one of the great things the Prince's Trust did for me was that they gave me, they were very dubious about it as a career move and as a business opportunity. And they said, well, we'll give you £250 as a test marketing grant. So back in the early 90s, it was all actual letters with stamped addressed envelopes and questionnaires. And they encouraged me to write to all the people I could think of who might want to employ my services as a costume maker. And with the short questionnaire and the stamped addressed envelope, which I did. And the response was really positive, which was great for me and reassuring for the Prince's Trust, who were willing then to support me. And it meant I had this kind of beginning of a portfolio of customers and clients that I could then kind of tout myself out to. So I'll probably stop about there because that's where it very quickly merges into the Tudor Tailor after that stage, and I'll let Jane take up her story.
So I had a bit of trouble getting into this meeting, so I hope everybody can hear me. Yep. I see some people nodding, that's good. So my story is very different from Ninya's. I've tried very hard to merge an academic scholarly career with a commercial one, and I always knew from a young age that I wanted to run my own business, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. My first degree is in journalism, so my first experience of touting myself around for money was being a freelancer, although I did work as a full-time sub-editor for trade journals. As my first job, I was sub-editor for Building Design, the architectural newspaper that comes out once a week, and that was a really good background in writing fast copy, writing good headlines, and also working in a very exacting environment for ensuring that what you write is correct and that it's in appropriate grammar. And I was very grateful during that first job for the fact that I had a really terrifying English teacher at my school in South Wales, who was fearsome about grammar and punctuation. In Wales, the curriculum stayed very old-fashioned in terms of grammar school education. Even though I went to a comprehensive, the grammar school system was still in place. Whereas in England, it dropped away much sooner. So I've always felt that I benefited from that incredibly rigorous education in writing precisely and correctly. So maybe it wasn't such a stretch to then do a journalism degree, which I actually specialised in science journalism and radio journalism, neither of which I actually managed to do professionally. However, I still have a great interest in both those things, and I do like very much the idea of trying to marry together arts and humanities interests with scientific approaches. And I think we live in quite a difficult world for people who want to be interdisciplinary. So along the way, I've also picked up a postgraduate qualification in law, because I think law teaches you a particular way of thinking. But before I got to that stage, I did a postgrad diploma in heritage interpretation, and that's where I learned that there was actually a profession for people who wanted to present history to the public at historic sites in new and innovative ways. And I had previously joined various reenactment societies, and the first one I joined was to be a Viking, thanks to Blue Peter, which those of you who are British will know is a children's television programme, which I shouldn't have been watching as an undergraduate when I should have been studying. But I went to York when the Jorvik Viking Festival began and became a Viking. And then I graduated to the Wars of the Roses, late 15th century. And after that, eventually went to Kentwell, which Ninya mentioned, is where lots of people have cut their teeth on being a Tudor 24 hours a day. And it is an exacting program in terms of talking to the visitors, knowing what you're talking about when you're talking to the visitors, and having a decent costume to wear. So while I was doing my heritage interpretation diploma, I decided that it would be a good idea to set up a business doing professional costumed interpretation. And I was lucky enough to gain contracts from local authorities who wanted to put on festivals with costumed interpreters. And eventually I landed the contract to introduce costumed interpreters for the historic royal palaces. And that was, again, it was a very exacting period in my life, because those kinds of contracts were only awarded under the compulsory competitive tender system. And that meant that you had to put together a rigorous business proposal for what you were going to do, which was detailed in terms of the service you'd provide and the budget that you would have to stick to. And over the years that I ran costumed interpretation projects, I recruited and trained people as costumed interpreters in terms of how they interacted with the visitors, but I also needed to costume them appropriately. And at the same time, I did consultancy work for Buckingham Palace on their front of house interaction with visitors. And I worked for Historic Scotland and Cadw in Wales, looking at how people can interact fruitfully with visitors in order to provide a meaningful visitor experience. And that led eventually to me doing a PhD in exactly that. What is the impact of costumed interpretation in the visitor experience? My intention with that was to, if you like, make the business case for costumed interpretation to be done with proper investment and with a sense of professionalism. And that, in a way, is how Ninya and I came to work together, because I needed someone who would understand the kind of costuming that I needed to clothe the interpreters in what would be their everyday garments. These weren't theatrical costumes. These were clothes being worn day in, day out, as people's bodies changed, as people had babies, as people had illnesses. There were all kinds of issues that we address that you don't have to address in the same way with theatrical clothing. And I'm pleased to say that what we learnt together at Hampton Court, particularly in the final year of my contract there in 2004, when we interpreted Queen Elizabeth's reign, led to our book, The Tudor Tailor, which, as we were saying last week when we were in America and we saw Angela in person only a week ago, we can't quite believe that was 20 years ago that we embarked on writing The Tudor Tailor. And I am still 10 years older than Ninya, even though I keep hoping I'll get younger or she'll get older and we'll somehow merge in the middle. So I don't know, we've probably both talked too much already, haven't we? But maybe we should say a few words about the Tudor tailor.
Yeah, well, as you say, we just told this story, which we're not in the habit of doing very often. But when we were in the States, we thought it was a good moment 20 years on to actually have a little reminisce about how this all came about. But as Jane said, in 2003, we did a whole programme of events at Hampton Court to commemorate the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. And we had to produce over 30 costumes in a very short period of time for a time frame that we hadn't done at the palace before, the 1590s, 1600. And all of our research and efforts in making these sets of clothes very quickly generated a lot of material, which we displayed to the public as part of those events during the year of 2003. And the public seemed to be really interested in the process that went on behind the making of the clothes that the interpreters wore. And so we had already had this thought during our years at Hampton Court that what we were doing was giving us quite rare and unique insights into not only how to make 16th century dress, but how to alter it and how to launder it and how to maintain it and all these things. And we did think we really ought to write it down. So 2004 is when we decided to do that, and the book came out in 2006. And the initial plan was that we would follow it very quickly with a book called The Stuart Tailor, and then we'd do a book called The Georgian Tailor, and then we might do a book called the Medieval or the Gothic Tailor. But we have become absolutely embedded in the 16th century because we've discovered, of course, that the more you find out, the less you know, and the more questions there are. So we've not managed to crawl out of the 16th century. But as a result of the Tudor Tailor book, it of course contains patterns and instructions for making garments. Almost straight away, we published some of those patterns as full-size versions, a bit like modern dressmaking patterns, which were well received. So eventually we have produced nearly all of the patterns in the Tudor Tailor as full-size patterns, and most of the patterns in our subsequent books that we've released. And out of that has grown a very important side of our business as the Tudor Tailor, which is as an outlet, a supplier of materials and resources for other people to make 16th century dress.
Amazing. Thank you so much for those insights. So we're going to move on now to Leimomi. Is it okay for you to chat now, or do you want to go after Angela? Yeah? Okay, great. So talking about patterns, we'll now move on to Leimomi. So Leimomi Oakes is a costume historian and a pattern maker behind Scroop Patterns and the Dreamstress blog. Again, I'm sure many people here know of both of these things. So she is a senior tutor of costume construction at Toi Whakaari, which is the New Zealand Drama School. So we're very, very glad to have her here tonight because it's very late in New Zealand. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're most welcome. Not as bad as it would be in Australia. Kia ora koutou. Hello, everybody. So I'm Leimomi. I'm a pattern maker. I'm a historian. I feel like I'm in quite a different situation to what we've just heard. As you can tell from my accent, I'm originally American. I was born and raised in Hawaii, on quite a small isolated island, so not a lot of access to museums and history, but I was fascinated with that from childhood. Excellent public library system though, and I certainly made good use of all their costume books and their history books. And then I thought I'd study something practical, and I studied international relations and got to the end and realized I did not want a job in that at all. And studied art history and costume construction. And costuming was really just for fun. And I worked in a costume shop in university and made money, but I wasn't going to go into that field. And I originally worked in museums. And when I moved to New Zealand, I worked for the Museum of New Zealand to Papa Tongarewa for 5 years. And giving tours in I was a registrar, loans and acquisitions, but I occasionally got asked to give tours in the textile collection because I knew a lot about it. When the curators or collection managers were busy, and giving a tour in the collection to a university group, they said, "You're amazing at teaching. Would you come and teach a course for us?" And so I went and taught a course at Massey University here in Wellington in their textile design department, and realized that I really, really love teaching. So I merged from that into teaching sewing and history, moving away from museums, really getting into research, and really polished up my pattern making skills from university. And New Zealand is amazing. We have access to some kinds of history that you really don't, but in terms of costuming history, it is very isolated. And so ordering a pattern from overseas, the pattern might be $30 US, but shipping is $70. And so you've spent $100 on the pattern alone before it gets here. And there's no workshops to go to like there are in the US or in the UK. And so I really started researching and compiling information, and the whole ethos behind Scroop Patterns is to provide the sort of resources and teaching for that I can't access here. And so with my patterns, it's like the goal is for them to be a whole class and to provide all the contextual information, not just do this, but here's why you do this, and here's some other options for doing this. Whilst there are some, I mostly do 18th century and Edwardian, and while there's lots and lots of Edwardian garments here in New Zealand and a surprising amount of 18th century garments, rather than recreating one exact garment for a pattern most of the time, which is frequently the case with more modern pattern makers, I really went, what if you took one exact garment and then researched all the garments that really look like that? So you could really put this garment within its context. And so create a pattern for, say, a pair of stays that represents a very common style as shown in prints and as shown in extant garments. Or take a pattern from an exact Edwardian skirt, but then find all the magazine references for exactly that kind of skirt and see the ways in which that kind of skirt was decorated differently or had different pockets or had different trim, so that I could incorporate those as other designs. In terms of doing research, well, the modern world has made that really, really amazing, and that there's all these online archives. And the very nice thing about New Zealand is because it's so small, it's very easy to sort of get the word out if you're hoping to research something, and suddenly have someone show up and go, "Oh, I heard you wanted a 1910s corset in this style. I have one." In fact, that happened to me over this weekend. One particular thing that I'm hoping to research, someone would just said, "Hey, I have this and it seems like your field. Do you want to study it?" And we're quite informal and word gets around. But I do also go overseas on study trips to see the things I can't see here. And then I've collaborated on the 18th century patterns with Amber Mendenhall Welch, who trained at Colonial Williamsburg and has this amazing wealth of 18th century knowledge. So we use her 18th century knowledge and then pair it with my pattern making skills and my pedantic attention to detail in a pattern, where she goes, "And then we're going to do this." And I go, "But what if you do it this way or this way or this way? Are those accurate? Can I change this just this tiny bit? And exactly where does this example come from?" yeah, I guess that's me.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's so, interesting in like hearing everybody's backstories and how you all came to where you are right now. So our final speaker is Angela Burnley. So Angela is the owner of Burnley and Trowbridge Company. Again, I'm sure everybody in this room knows Burnley and Trowbridge, which is a multifaceted historical textile business in Williamsburg, and it's currently in its 30th year. So as an independent researcher focusing on textiles in the 18th century in particular, she has studied collections in the US and abroad, as well as lectured and taught on the topic. So she most recently completed a fellowship at the Winterthur Museum, where she focused on the work of Florence Montgomery. So again, we're very, very happy to have you here today, Angela. I know it's quite early there for you, so take it away. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know, my technology skills, Jane and I think we're in the same boat trying to get on here, but I am here and I'm glad. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much. I guess my story begins in the 80s. Well, actually, before that, I hold a degree in interior design, and I actually practiced in my discipline for a number of years in New York, and opened my own business. And with the stress of all that, met someone when my children were very, very small, who was part of an 18th century reenactment group. And I said, well, that sounds interesting. And I've always, I taught at New York Institute of Technology, and one of my favorite courses to teach was textiles. And, you know, so I was like, well, I don't know a lot about fashion, but I know a lot about architecture and interiors, and let's see what I can do with this. So being my usual self, my very first reenactment, I was staying up all night sewing and trying to figure out in a very quick manner how to look appropriate, and very quickly saw all my mistakes, and just deep dived into this reenactment stuff. So fast forward to moving to Williamsburg, I was at a reenactment, met my present husband. It was a very tiny reenactment, and he had a little tent set up with linen in it. And at this point in time, we're talking, you know, early 90s, linen was hard to come by. And I knew it was right. And he also had another linen cotton textile that I was like, oh, I know this is right. I've read about this. I know this. So fast forward again, we became husband and wife, and actually started our business. Believe me, when I think back on it, I couldn't get a job as a designer here in Williamsburg. At that time, it was very small. There was one designer in town, actually a decorator, who had no interest in expanding or allowing anyone else. And I knew nobody and had no way of developing another company at that time, and didn't feel like it. I had very tiny children. And he had this business, and I had a business head, and he did too, but this was like part-time, make money to reenact business. And I said, you know, we could take this full time. And he goes, you're crazy. And I said, well, nothing from nothing is nothing. We have no money. We have $8,000 in inventory that you have. Let's do it. So we hit the road. And at that time, there was no internet. I designed a catalog, and we started doing shows, mostly 18th century reenactments, and we handed out catalogs. And slowly and very, very, very slowly, we started building the business. And our big goal was to have 50% of our business be mail order. Very exciting. Fast forward again, the internet. We struggled. We were like, we got to have a website. People are doing it, but we don't know how to do it. Well, my husband built our very first website, which was a struggle, a big struggle, but we were determined. It was really mostly bootstrap. We were self-financed. in all honesty, we never borrowed a penny for our business. We built our business on our own money. If we got an extra $100, that extra $100 went into buying more cloth. So as we started developing the business, that went correlated with, I had already done a tremendous amount of interiors research, obviously, because I taught textiles, but I had to make that leap to fashion. And that was really interesting to me because I saw all these correlations between fashion and architecture and design and how they basically walked hand in hand through history. And that was always a neat thing for me. So I felt empowered to start to understand the textiles more from a fashion standpoint. I had always had a personal interest in sewing. I used to sew all my own clothes until I went to college, and it became difficult because I was very busy. But again, I was doing this research because I kept saying, we've got to be the best. Well, in essence, we were it. We had found a niche market and nobody else was really out there doing it. There was one person, Beth Gilgun, who made a name for herself back in the day, who sewed fabric. And I come to find out she was buying her fabric from Jim, my husband. He was selling it to her wholesale. So she was building things and she was doing a lot of research. So I looked at what she was doing and said, well, I can do this too. And so I really deep dived into textiles. And each time I learned something, I tried to incorporate it into my business. So of course the business grew to encompass things that complemented textiles. We started carrying, patterns. We started carrying notions and things like that. And again, each one of these things had to be researched. So I had, prior to meeting my husband, because I am an entrepreneur, had started a little shoe business. And I brought that into our company. I had one shoemaker who has since, we have closed that part of the business because he became ill. And after a 30-year run, because I have been selling shoes since the late 80s, to finance my reenacting, I didn't feel that I wanted to start that over again because we had together built this shoe business literally based on, because he was Colombian and spoke no English at the time, but later became an American citizen, on a handshake and an interpreter. And we had both learned together quite a bit. The shoe business was very viable for a long time. When it finally went away, it was sad, and I was sad, but our business at that point in time was very healthy. We had a lot of other aspects of our business that were part of, our selling. And once we got our website up, and when social media started to become a thing, we went from paper advertising to doing this social media. And believe me, like me trying to get on this meeting this morning, it was not easy. I don't seem to have a head for that. But I did it because, again, I saw it as another avenue of finding people and creating a network of people that would be interested in our products. I also got involved with manufacturing because I would get my hands on an antique and I'd say, wow, if we could just get this out into the community, that would be great. I was very aggressively going after museums, especially living history museums, and saying, hey, you want my stuff? My stuff is good. And early on, I had a special interest in handkerchiefs and started selling handkerchiefs that I had just found that had the aesthetic, but then quickly discovered that if I could reproduce actual antiques that were correct, or actual reproductions on antiques that were correct, that would be a step above. So each time I added something to our business, it was to, again, give the community something, the costume and living history and historic community something that would up their game, would give them something that was more authentic once again. So Another thing that happened, and this was back in 2002, I had become good friends with all the makers at Colonial Williamsburg and had become good friends with the mistress of the Margaret Hunter shop and the master of the Tailor shop, Janae Whitaker and Mark Hutter. And I saw them both do demonstrations on stage for things for Colonial Williamsburg. And I was like, they have so much knowledge. Why is this knowledge not out there? Why do people not know how the 18th century mantua maker and the 18th century tailor built their clothing and what their thought process was behind it? And so I approached them. I said, would you be interested in doing classes for me? I will do everything. You just show up and teach, and I will help you. And that began the historical fashion workshop series, which is, been since 2002. So we're in our 22nd year now. And this really grew exponentially. I watched it, and I can't, as I told Jane and Ninya when we were having our round table in person, I could not say, I can't go back, because Jane's great with graphs and pie charts and all that good stuff. I can't go back and do a chart to say how much we influence the community, but I want to think we influence the community greatly, because we were the first ones, again, out there to do these workshops and to bring it to another level. So all of these things together led us to a more modern age where the business had grown to a point where I was hiring people and people with expertise, which led to us doing online workshops, which led us to doing our YouTube, which funny enough, it was something that I'd had a discussion with Christina, who worked for me for a period of time. I'd said, I want to do some stuff on YouTube. I want to get my YouTube going because it stinks and it's awful. And she says, well, I do filming. And I said, okay. And so we had this discussion about doing some sew-alongs because it would encourage people to, again, there were two avenues. It would provide free education, but also possibly encourage loyalty of people wanting to buy our product. So we did a lot of filming, and COVID hit, and I was a bubble with my people. We didn't go anywhere or do anything except work. And Christina was at that point working at Colonial Williamsburg, got laid off, and said, hey, I got time. Would you like me to edit those videos for you? And I said, sure. So she edited them. We started putting them up, and the rest is history, because people were dying being at home. And it gave this big boom to our business. So that took us to another height again, where now we were in demand and it was expected of us. Keep educating us, keep bringing things to the plate. So at that point, that is where we are now. We are a very solid business. Again, bootstraps up, and it's a lovely business. I have 2 full-time employees and 1, 2, 3, I think 4 part-time employees. And all of them have specialties and expertise that brings something wonderful to the Burnley and Trowbridge community. Our team, and yeah, we are 100% online at this point. I occasionally have done a show, but don't like to admit it, but my gray hair tells it, getting old. And those shows were hard. In the early days, Jim and I would do 26 to 28 shows a year. So if you can fathom getting in a truck, hooking up a trailer full of your product and tents and all the stuff that goes with being period appropriate, running down the road, setting all this stuff up, humping thousands of pounds of fabric, which Jim and I can both tell you has done a number on our shoulders. We both had shoulder surgery since then. It was hard. It was a hard life. And it was a sort of a, as my kids would say when they were little, Mama, what are we having for dinner? And I'd say cowboy food, beans and cornbread, because meat's too expensive. So it was a hard life in the beginning, but it resulted in a really wonderful business that I'm very proud of and very happy to be a part of the community. And that's me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I think what we're going to do is maybe have like a bit of a round table chat. I've got a couple of questions that maybe I think everybody could speak to, just sort of building off what you've all said. And then we do have questions from the audience. But I guess my first question is that, I mean, something that you all mentioned was, I mean, your businesses often being born out of not just your own interest in historical dress and, well, the own needs of your costuming, but also that of the communities that you're part of. You know, there was, as you said, Angela, you noticed like a niche area where, you know, that needed to be filled. And I was wondering if you all could expand on the importance of collaboration and networks and bringing together different skill sets. And then I also had, like, I guess, a question about, has there ever been any resistance in sharing the knowledge of these communities, or have you ever, I guess, like, thought twice about sharing your own knowledge through your businesses? I don't know. I think these are just sort of questions that I guess I have that I think, you know, you were all sort of speaking to in a way in your talk. So whoever would like to go first, but, you know, the importance of community, but also of knowledge, and yeah.
I will, from a standpoint that early on, I was very interested in researching so that I can make my product, you know, using modern textiles and that kind of thing as appropriate as possible. I didn't want to just sell people anything. I really wanted to be knowledgeable. And what I discovered early was that trying to get into museums and collections, it was very difficult because I didn't have, like Jane, a PhD, or I wasn't associated with a college, et cetera, university. So that was hard. And I had to really prove myself. I had to be very professional. I had to do all the due diligence to present myself in a very knowledgeable and professional manner, to slowly gain the trust of these scholars and these museums. Now it is easier. We have a whole, in fact, I can proudly say that many of the young people that are out there as curators, I knew from the beginning. I was Mama Cloth to some of them, and they are now, they have a very different attitude. So as a new entrepreneur, you would probably have a much easier time of doing research than I did back in the day. And of course, we have the internet, which makes a huge difference as well. I would also say that sharing information, it's always a slippery slope, in the sense that I have many times found my information online, because I'm not published at this point. I lecture, I teach, but I don't have anything in writing. I'm not a prolific writer, and it is very much birthing an elephant for me. So I have found many times that information that I have, my personal unpublished information, has been put out on the internet without citation. And that's really difficult, but then you've got to balance it. Do I tell people? Do I not tell people? It's really difficult. You have to trust the people that you collaborate with, and know that they have your best interests at heart. And we have done collaborations that have been incredibly successful. So it can happen.
Yeah, I would just follow on from what Angela said, and I mean, I think collaboration is nearly always a rewarding and worthwhile thing to do in its many senses. And I think that there's definitely been a change in attitude to sharing information, which is a bit of a double-edged sword, because when we first started out, I think there was much more of a a closed down nature to people doing their own research and being very reluctant to share their research with anyone else in fear of it being stolen. And now, partly probably quite a lot to do with the internet, it's so much easier to share things. Things do get shared. So many museum collections are online, which is fantastic. But I think it has made people less respectful and less aware of the etiquette of citing other people's work and asking permission to share other people's work. So it's made it a lot easier to learn and a lot easier to share, which is great, but you're more vulnerable as well as a result.
Oh, yeah. Maybe.
Definitely feeling like interesting because a generational difference here in just how we were trained. Collaborations are absolutely sort of core to how I work. For me, the modern world expects us to have every possible skill. You can't just be a pattern maker. You also have to be a photographer, and you have to be able to do the social media. And people keep asking me to do YouTube videos, and you have to be able to sew the thing, and you also have to be able to run workshops. And it is not possible to do all those things. And there's also an attitude where you have to know everything. And you know, the most popular YouTubers, and when you admit that you don't know something, people jump in and correct you, and suddenly you're not an expert. We don't have to be an expert on everything. So collaboration is both going, I don't have this area of expertise. Who can I work with? And then there's just, like, for me, ongoing collaboration, having someone to bounce ideas off of. One of my closest friends is a professional editor, and she edits my patterns. Any mistakes in them are because I went back and changed things after she did her final edit. And that's just having that extra brain. But as much as we're expected to do everything in the modern world, I really think, like, I don't see the point of hoarding knowledge, because there is an endless amount of history and knowledge to study. And definitely always acknowledge where you got information from. But, you know, I don't worry about having my patterns in digital format. Yes, someone might steal them, but more importantly, I do the good of making them accessible to a lot of people who couldn't buy a paper thing and have it shipped to them. So I try to have an attitude of abundance. Like, there's so much history to research. There's so much knowledge to research. I don't need to feel proprietary about it, because there's so much. And I think most people are savvy and do look around and see who is just copying other people's work. And I really think if you are just doing enough good research and work, your reputation builds itself to a point that you don't have to worry about people copying you, because people will know that they're copying you. And that's sort of how I operate, not worrying about hoarding my information, but just focusing on sharing and trusting that there's enough interesting research to keep doing forever.
Yeah, Jane?
I think there's a big difference between, and I don't know your specific circumstances, but there's a big difference between having a full-time job that pays your bills and running the Tudor Tailor, which Ninya and I used to say it was a hobby that paid for itself in the early days. But now we have a much bigger infrastructure and responsibilities, like Angela was mentioning. You know, we have people who work for us who rely on us being able to pay their salaries or their fees. And I feel strongly that we have to pay those people in an ethical way. And that's a very different thing from running it as a bit of a sideline, where you don't have to make sure you cover your overheads, which become immense when once a business starts to be a real business, which is, as Ninya mentioned, once we started to sell patterns and fabrics and an enormous range of things that we knew the community of 16th century reenactors would value, we still had to be realistic about how we could bring those to the marketplace and how we could cover all our costs and be sustainable. And that's a very different thing. I'm repeating myself now, but it's a very different thing from running a business as a sort of sideline where you can afford maybe to give things away as an act of generosity. We have done that in the past. I mean, every time we write a journal article, an academic journal article, we give that away. Sometimes you have to pay to get a journal article published. If you want it open access, which I firmly believe in, you have to pay. You know, my most recent open access, it was €5,000 to get that out there so that anyone can read it, rather than it being behind a paywall or only available through the academic university system. So it's good to share, but it costs to share, either actual costs to make it shareable, or what you lose by sharing and not thinking about protecting the base that you work from.
Scroop is not a hobby business. It is my primary income. But I've always operated in, don't treat everybody else as a rival. Like, I just think, like, the more we share and make costuming really welcome and inclusive, and I don't see it as giving away information. I see it as, like, basically advertising, but advertising that teaches.
Sorry, Angela, did you want to?
I think to jump on that, everything that we've done as far as a sharing thing does have a money aspect to it, per se. It is another form of advertising. It is another form of creating loyalty. And it's meant purposely, because we want our customers to keep coming back. We want our customers to feel comfortable and to feel that we are a knowledgeable source for them. And yes, I have had people order every one of my samples and say, oh, by the way, I'm taking these to my local fabric district so I can go shopping. And can't do anything with that. You just have to say, okay, thank you very much, and carry on. In the beginning, and I will say this, Leimomi, because you are younger than me, in the beginning of building our business, Jim and I both went into this business originally, and so it was our entire income, and there wasn't much. So I was very much a fight or die kind of entrepreneur. I wanted to be out there. If somebody did something good, I did it better. If somebody had one product, I wanted to do better. In the very beginning, we even had gentlemen's agreements because Beth was still out there and we were selling to her. So we made a gentleman's agreement that our retail would all be the same. And then we had a competitor come in who said, I'm not being a gentleman. So if you're going to price it at 15, I'm going to price it at 14. But that person didn't back it up with knowledge. And every time I got scared and thought that I was not going to be able to continue to push the business forward, I learned that the really strong roots that I was making with everything we were doing, the amount of information that we gave for free, and it wasn't everything. We didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we gave people what they needed in order to do one step better. And with that type of thought process in mind, slowly we built these incredibly strong roots that eventually led to a tree, which is very sturdy. and far sturdier than any of the competitors that have come in since then. I've watched so many competitors come and go. Once they saw that here's Angela and Jim in their tent and nobody can get in, it's so busy. Oh boy, I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go to the fabric district and buy some fabric and sell it. Once they never backed it up with everything, all the little seeds that I planted to make all those roots that grew together to make that amazing tree. So for me, on a daily basis, sharing is something that I look at with should I share this? Will this benefit the community? Will it benefit me? And that's kind of where I'm at with it. You know, from a researcher standpoint, I'm recognized in scholar circles. It took me a long time to get there, even though I haven't published. But I have lectured here and overseas, and that has led to an understanding that Angela knows more than we realize, and that again raises the bar so that people aren't so quick to like come and say, I'm just going to grab all her information and pretend it's mine. It does happen. Believe me, it happens. I had a teacher actually, quote, word for word. This is a guy that was running a little thing online about 18th century, I don't know, ads or something. And he was a teacher doing this with his students. And he literally word for word took a part of my lecture and posted it as his own. So it does happen. But you have to hope that, you know, for the most part, you're rising above all that. So, and that's me.
Thank you. We might move on to questions, but I did just want to say, I mean, I think your perspectives of, you know, giving a little to get a little are really interesting in terms of free advertising. And I should say, Leimomi, I was like a huge fan of your blog when I first sort of got into this world. And it was nice to know there was someone else, like you're in New Zealand, I'm in Australia. I'm like, oh, someone else who's like not part of these communities that I wish I was part of. And I always found, you know, the information that you shared was always very generous. And I guess also that's why I still know who the Dreamstress is. And I know who Scroop Patterns is because, you know, I remembered your blog from, you know, what that you've had for years and that
it's been around for a very long time.
So yeah, but it was, you know, as a fledgling little like sewer, you know, costumer, it was great. So, you know, we all like very much appreciate everybody's knowledge sharing.
And I learned so much from you guys as the generation before me.
So we have some questions from the audience that I'm going to ask. So Jordan says, I would like to ask both Ninya and Jane, or anyone who wants to answer, what degrees they would recommend for someone pre-university who's certain they want a career in dress history.
Yeah, Jane.
So if I ever talk to youngsters or people who are thinking of going back to college as mature students, I always say, just study what you love. You know, if maths makes you happy, do a maths degree. You can still be a professional costume researcher after that. And the reason I say that is that, you know, you have to have a passion for education, whatever you're going to study. And I didn't know that you could be what I became when I was doing my A-levels and then my degree. I invented the professional job of being a costumed interpreter in the UK. It didn't exist. There were very few places you could be a professional costumed interpreter. And in a lot of places, they weren't called costumed interpreters. They were called actors, like at the Museum of the Moving Image, which employed people who were actually security guards. But in order to make them more interesting, they put them into period costume and gave them a role. And I don't think you can't plan where your career is going to go. So it's better to study something that you know you're going to be able to sustain your interest in for, you know, the 3 years or the 2 years or the single year that you're studying, and then use that information to make your toolbox to become what you want to become. because as Angela said, she's an entrepreneur. I regard myself as an entrepreneur. I forged myself, and I think everyone has the capacity to forge themselves. You go out and you find the resources you need. And, that doesn't always involve borrowing money. Like Angela, I've never done that. I've always worked in a supermarket part-time or done part-time lecturing in order to fund what I wanted to do. And I think Ninya's a really good example of this, because as she said, she didn't get on very well at school. She actually didn't go to school very much. She really has forged herself.
Yeah, and I would just add that by the time I went to the London College of Fashion, and I was so pleased to get in there, especially considering I had 0 qualifications, I was horrified at the number of students who left in the first 3-month period because they'd selected the course as something that looked really interesting and they probably thought was quite an easy option, and it wasn't. And it's exactly what you're saying, Jane. If you don't actually have the passion behind it, there's no point in doing it.
Angela?
I'm just going to say one more thing, that, when I went to school for interior design, it was all I wanted. I went to a well-regarded school. I went to school for 5 years in order to get my degree. And my last year, I told my mother that I'd made a mistake. I wanted to be a graphic designer. And she told me to shut up and graduate, which was a good idea. And I never thought that I would do anything else, because I lived and ate and worshiped interior design and architecture. It was my gig. I had no idea that I would be who I am now, but I remember something my mother said when I told her that I was starting this business. And she said, well, I just read something in the Wall Street Journal that everyone has at least 2 distinct careers in their lifetime. And I was like, yay, because I was sure she was going to be angry, and she was instead very encouraging. And it has led me down a completely different road. And I do segue back and forth. I can take knowledge from my previous life and apply it to my present life. So I would say, if you're asking yourself questions about what degree to get, what is sparking you at this moment in time? Just like Jane said, what is sparking you? Do you see yourself as a curator? Do you see yourself as a dress historian who lectures all over the world? Do you see yourself as a writer? There's all these different avenues that you can take. Yes, Jane.
I just wanted to say that I'm 60 at the end of July, and I have spent my whole life trying to decide what I want to be when I grow up.
Yeah.
And for the first time, I've been offered a permanent academic post at Uppsala University, which I'll start on the 1st of August, literally 3 days after my 60th birthday. So I think I might finally have worked out what I want to be when I grow up, but we'll see when I get there.
Well, good. I'm going to come visit you.
We'll all come visit you, Jane. I've never been to Sweden. I would love to go.
It's amazing.
So we had a couple of similar questions. So I'm just going to smush them together. So curious, for all those who produce patterns, do you tend to produce them in a modern style with modern construction, or do your patterns follow the cutting construction methods of the time? And so the other part of a different question that is similar is, do you also draft the patterns from the originals and then grade the patterns to fit a modern body? Does a modern body exist, I guess? Or do you stay true to the original lines of the garment? So I guess this is about, how do you decide about how you're going to take your patterns, how you're going to produce them, and then what methods of construction you're going to promote? Maybe Leimomi can speak to this one.
Yes. So for 18th century patterns, I meld 18th century dressmaking techniques and modern pattern techniques, because 18th century dressmaking techniques, you'd be almost exclusively draping on the body, or you'd be such a good pattern cutter that you could just look at someone and draw it out. So there's no such thing as a printed pattern in the modern sense in the 18th century. So obviously you can't sell an 18th century pattern because such a thing didn't exist. So I have a pattern that's a basic block, and then the instruction steps sometimes include here's the completely historical way to do it, where you are draping on the body and then really altering your pattern. And then here's how to do it if you're working alone on yourself, which was really not how clothes were made for most people in the 18th century. So it's trying to find a balance of how to get the closest to an accurate thing as a modern maker. And then, of course, balancing in that people might be making this for the first time, which is not what would have happened historically. You would be an apprentice under someone, so you'd never just be on your own figuring this out. So it can't be a perfect historical recreation, but I attempt to give people the closest possible tools to create that effect and to understand how to do it historically, but how to use my pattern. And then when we come to Edwardian, you can make it very, very similar to an actual Edwardian pattern, just with much, much, much more detailed instructions. Because Edwardian patterns tend to be quite brief. In terms of fit, I have body models that are consistent across my patterns. So if you fit one of my patterns, all of them should fit you in the same way. So if you generally, with some exceptions, like with my 2 18th century stays patterns that I did with Amber, the Cassandra, and the Augustas, we explain that because of the way those kind of stays fit your body, Amber and I both wear exactly the same fit in the Augusta stays, but I have to lengthen the torso of the Cassandra stays quite a bit for myself. And that's just because of how those type of stays are meant to fit compared to your bone structure. And so, but generally I use one body block, and sometimes I find that a historical pattern fits exactly. And sometimes it really doesn't. So is there such a thing as the historical body? Some things, yes. Usually modern arms are much thicker than any sort of pre-1950s arms. Better early childhood nutrition gives us lovely, beefy quads. But a surprising number of historical patterns have fit me almost exactly. So I wouldn't say there's a modern body. I would say there's always been a good range of bodies. And but yeah, I aim for one consistent block, knowing that in any period I've found examples that fit my block and my body exactly. That's how I do it.
That last point you made was exactly the point I was going to make. I don't think there is such thing as a period body that's different to a modern body, with the slight exception of that generally we're all a bit heavier now than we used to be, but there was always diversity both sideways and upways. And what we're left with in museum collections for various reasons give us a skewed idea of how people looked in the past. So when you're producing a set of patterns for modern people, the problem would have been the same in the 16th century or the 18th century or now, that you can never make one pattern that works for every individual. And one of the improvements we've tried to make lately is just giving more guidance to how to adapt the patterns for different body proportions, to do that to some point or another.
Oh, Jane?
I'm just going to give a little shout out to our knitting instructions in the typical Tudor, because we have made those absolutely bespoke, the sleeves and the stockings. If you measure yourself and follow the grids we've provided, you can actually knit so that it fits you perfectly. And that is one of the glories of knitting.
So I'm going to add a totally different avenue, because many years ago, I bought a pattern company, and the individual who had done those patterns was known in our reenactment community, in our history community. And she and Janice Ryan were the only two people, well, actually she preceded Janice, I believe, in making patterns that people could get their hands on, that would take them a step above. If you remember, I got in the 80s, so we have just gone past the bicentennial, and people were taking McCall's patterns and hacking them up to make gowns, whatever. So there's nothing out there. So both of these individuals had started making patterns, and we bought the one where she said she just wasn't capable of handling it. And I could not adjust those patterns, and many times they were only one size, but I could clean up the hot mess that she had made them, which I spent 8 years doing, literally in my spare time, pixel by pixel, cleaning up these awful patterns that had been drawn on yellow trace paper and had been made from really old sepias, which some of you might not know what that is. But anyway, it's nasty looking and handwritten with, chicken scratch. So I made them presentable because I knew people aren't going to buy a product that is in that manner. So everything was typefaced, everything was clean. But as time went on, a lot of people came out, like Leimomi. All these folks started presenting these really amazing patterns. And I was like, well, I spent the money on this company. I don't want it to go away. How can I change it or update it? And that began us developing our own patterns. And this was with the help of my team. We started doing our own set of patterns, and they actually started with my sew-alongs. And that was a cap pattern that I had drafted and a bedgown pattern that I had drafted. And it was based on things I wanted, and it kind of went from there. And as far as sizing and that kind of thing, we tried to give as much information as we can in our patterns in respects to fit, but typically our patterns at this point are not fitted like a gown pattern would be fitted or a stay pattern would be fitted. So we haven't had to jump that river yet. But as we move along, then that will involve more collaboration on my part because we don't have someone in-house that's capable of doing that. And I don't pretend to know to do that. So we will cross that bridge and start moving in that direction as we develop more patterns that are in our to-do list and slowly phase out our other pattern company.
Great. Thank you. I didn't know you had a pattern, Angela, so I'll have to look that up. I didn't know you had patterns.
We have a whole series of Burnley and Trowbridge patterns.
I'm dipping my toes in the 18th century, starting to. Serena has influenced me. So we have two questions that are both sort of speaking to the same thing about this sort of tension between the business mind or the business side of things, the need to make a profit, and the creative side of things. So, and in that creative side of things, historical accuracy. So one of the questions says, how do you balance them? Do these two principles ever conflict? For example, truly historical fabrics that were so expensive, you never sell enough volume to make them profitable. And how do you deal with these tensions between, I guess, the business side of things and the creative / historically accurate side of things?
Well, if we're going to talk textiles, I'll start. For me, my original mission statement was to bring the most historically accurate textiles made in a modern fashion that would represent textiles of the 18th century. So that's where I started, was the 18th century. And it's still my focus, my main focus when it comes to research, although I have pushed into the 19th century and back into the 17th century to a point. For me, it really as close as I could get. And doing that involved me writing my own definitions based on my research, and then explaining regarding the modern fabric, how that correlated or did not correlate to that. And again, the business part of me. So here I am, a researcher, and I'm saying, oh, well, this lasting is so good. I mean, it really is like what I have looked at in primary sources, but then I turn it over and it's not woven the same way, right? But on the right side, it's amazing. It's very close. It has a nice hand. It feels similar, etc. But that's the researcher part of me goes, but it's not 100%. But then the business part of me has to say, but I can sell this to my customers for $18 a yard, so that they can at least have that instead of some god awful fabric they've chosen on their own that's inaccurate. So aesthetically, they are going to look correct. And I may be overstepping here, but I do believe that at times, I know that Jane and Ninya do a lot of bespoke fabric, but aren't there times when you have to make compromises with your textiles? Yeah. So on that level, there's that. And then from a creative standpoint, I'm a very creative person. And it's a constant struggle for me because I want to just get lost in the creativity and not think about the money or the feasibility of doing something. I would love to go do all bespoke textiles. I would love it. I mean, I would reproduce everything that I have ever studied and be so excited. But it's not financially feasible, and nor does it have a market. And that's where you have to balance your business head with your creative side. And one is going to win.
Any other thoughts from anyone? Maybe Angela.
I definitely have patterns that I would love to create because they spark joy for me, but which I know are not commercially viable, either because they're such weird items that not a lot of people will buy them, or because they would take so much work to develop that I'd have to sell such a ridiculous amount of them. The ones that aren't so much work, I've sort of written myself a little list and say, if I can get up to making this much a year and I can get the pattern done in under this many, well, I can devote this many hours to starting that pattern as my treat for myself. And you know, maybe I can get the pattern done in that much time, and then maybe I have to wait until I hit the next benchmark to do something that is a joy hobby. But I have to be really careful to think about that as I'm doing this. I am doing this. You know, we all kind of have businesses that are partly what we love. You know, you don't get into this to make lots of money, even if it's a successful business. Very few of us are going to be retiring as millionaires. So when I do that, when I do impractical things, I have to really go, this is my free time. This is my indulgence time. It's really important as a self-employed person to make sure you have free time and indulgence time. And so that's when I let myself. And other than that, I just try to go, yeah, I know this would be really popular, but it doesn't spark joy. So what else would be really popular that I am excited about? And then hope I'm right about guessing what will be really popular.
So I guess it's, knowing your audience, knowing your customer, knowing your consumer base, which I guess is the basis of every business, right? Okay, so we have, so how do you see your historical dress businesses developing in the future? What is the next big challenge? For example, is there a role for AI? As somebody who's currently marking, I wish there wasn't a role for AI. What does everyone? Jane?
Well, I think there could be a role for AI that might be sparking joy, which Jodie, who Ninya and I work with, and I have talked about how you could generate ideas for ensembles of 16th century dress, which you could build from primary evidence. But that would be a very exciting thing to do. But as with all AI questions, it's only as good as the material you feed it. So we would have to feed it the stuff that we felt was accurate and reliable based on our research. And I don't know whether we have the resources to be able to do something like that as the Tudor tailor, even though I'm sure it's entirely feasible. Maybe we need to go and look for a business angel to make that happen.
Well, I guess we could focus on the first part of the question. Is there, I guess, where do you see your businesses developing? Or I guess, is there anything exciting that's like?
Well, I think Ninya and I would quite like to escape the 16th century at some point.
Yes, come to the 17th century. So maybe that's not where the business is, but it's it's an underappreciated century.
Yeah, no, we'd like to find out. And yeah, I can't even begin to think of something like an AI project when we've got so many of our other plans that we've made over the years and thought we'd probably have got to years ago and still haven't got to. So we're going to be kept busy for quite long enough without introducing a whole new concept, I think.
Oh, sorry, Leimomi.
The last few years for me have had so many like totally unexpected things that just threw my life into absolute chaos, that I'm not like, I just work on what I'm working on, and I don't want to disappoint myself or anyone else by announcing anything that might not happen. You know, hopefully there has been so much excitement, there will be no more excitement. I would like to live an uninteresting life. I would like doctors to say, wow, to not say, wow, I've read about this, but I've never seen it happen in 20 years of practicing. Yeah, so it's just more patterns, hopefully.
Yeah. Oh, Angela?
For us, one of the things that has always been exciting for me is, well, when we were talking about creativity, my reproduction work is where I get to play. And I pursued some licensing early on that began with the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum in DC, that began that whole journey. Since then, it has started to get legs. I have had other museums approach me and say, hey, would you do product for us? Reproduction product for us. And that's led me down this road, which is very exciting and that I enjoy very much. So that is something that I want to continue to pursue and develop. And I will say that it's not always very financially beneficial, but I still indulge myself because I love it. And I did a collaboration with Cheney McKnight, Not Your Mama's History, a while back, which got me into a different avenue. And we literally designed and developed these 3 handkerchiefs without antiques, but they became a signature product for her, and also allowed her to use them as a teaching prop, which was really neat. So that's really where I am. And we would like to do other patterns, but that is going to involve, it's going to be more detailed patterns. So that's going to be collaboration based. And how that's going to come about, I'm not sure. We're continuing to film. I have an amazing young lady who is a recent graduate who is learning and loving and very enthusiastic about everything that we do. So that has created another avenue. But that's kind of where we at. B&T, keep on keeping on. I've developed, in fact, I'm home right now, because I have been able to get an amazing team that can function on a daily basis without me. So this gives me more time to pursue joy. It also gives me more time to research and possibly more time to push down that scholar end, which of course I will always, go back to Burnley and Trowbridge. So that will benefit Burnley and Trowbridge as well. So that's us.
Awesome. Well, we have like 4 or 5 minutes left. So I guess Serena and I had like one final question for you all. If you could give, I guess, one piece of advice to someone wanting to commercialize their research in dress history, or, the number one bit of advice or the number one thing that you have learnt, if you had to pick one, what would it be?
When Ninya and I wanted to write the Tudor Tailor and we needed to find a publisher, we were told, we had help along the way. Valerie Cumming introduced us to Batsford and recommended that they hire, they don't pay you, they take us on. And we had to write a very detailed marketing plan of who would buy our book. And we had really no idea who would buy our book. But we did a lot of maths. We looked up how many courses there were in fashion design and theatrical costuming. We looked at how many Renaissance fairs there were in America. We added up as many potential markets as we could imagine. And that rigorous business plan for writing the book is what got us through the door at Batsford. And I would say that's what you need to do to be able to set out with confidence, is write a business plan that's based on statistical evidence of who you are going to serve.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Ninya. Go.
Yeah, I'm happy for Jane to leave that as my answer, what Jane's just said. And I just noticed that someone asked twice about how to approach museums, so I was just going to answer very, very quickly. In case it's not obvious, anyone can approach a museum and ask for an appointment. Just be as specific as you possibly can, because the worst thing you can do is say, hey, I'm really interested in 18th century dress. Can I come and look at some stuff? Which, sorry if that's patronising, but I think a lot of people do that. So do your research first. Tell the museum what it is you want to see and why you want to see it. And there's no reason why you shouldn't get an appointment.
Exactly. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Every museum, for the most part, unless it's a tiny museum, and then you can approach them in person, has their collection base online. So you can go through those collections and pick out the things that are appropriate for you. And then again, what Ninya said, you need to tell them why you want to see these things. It can't just be because I want to. It needs to be professional. Treat it as a professional meeting and you will get all the appointments you want. What I wanted to say is that if you are going into the commercial market, the most important thing you need to do is look for a niche. Look for something out there that has not been filled properly and look to do that. One of the struggles that I let bother me early on, and I did touch on that, was other fabric companies coming out. Well, many of them just modeled themselves after us. That's not being original. That's not attracting new customers, because why? People might shop with their pocketbook, but they won't shop again. So the important thing is to go with what you want to do, discover how that can fit into the community, and give the community something unique and special that they have not had before. And I truly believe that, because what we did would have never happened if we had not gotten into the market at the right time, filling the right niche, and continued to, push forward over the 30 years that we've been in business.
Leimomi, anything to add? Any wisdom?
I guess kind of what I'd also tell my students is don't let people walk over you and don't do things you're not morally comfortable with, because the other stuff has been covered by everybody else.
Good final words. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I'm just looking at the time. We're 1 minute past. I know everyone's very busy. But yeah, I mean, I think, I could keep asking you questions. I know everybody here could keep asking questions. There's a few questions we couldn't get through in the chat. So maybe we'll try and share those with our speakers. But thank you so much to our speakers, Ninya, Jane, Leimomi, and Angela, for joining us tonight. To Serena for being behind the scenes, sort of working the chat. This has been obviously our first online event, and we're really, really grateful that you all could take the time to speak to us and sort of share your many, many years of combined wisdom about commercializing, making historical dress. So we just wanted to remind everybody in the audience that the registration link for our festival in September is now online. So there are limited in-person places. We've put the link in the chat. Otherwise, we will be trying to live stream and film as much of it as possible. But oh, sorry, Angela, did you want to?
Can I make a little plug?
Yeah, of course.
Brooke Wellborn, who is the coordinator of our workshops, will be at the upcoming festival. So you can't miss that. And also the following weekend, I will be in Gloucester at Gloucester Cathedral giving a lecture for part of the Threads celebration that they do every year, which is very interesting because, as many of you know, Gloucester is, and Gloucestershire is part of the woolen industry from the 18th century. So they go back to their roots, and it's really fun, and they do a lot of amazing textile things. So that's my plug. I am a business person, sorry.
No, that's okay. If anyone else has a quick plug they want to do, you're more than welcome to. But if not, I think that's everything. And again, huge thank you to our speakers for joining us tonight, and to everybody for coming. We've had a big audience, so thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.